This talk was given to members of the Westbury Area branch of the Family History Society at the end of February. It's entitled Grave Investigations, looking at graves, not just the inscriptions, but also what a grave as a whole can actually teach us about our ancestors. Because in many ways, as with all aspects of family history, looking at graves is actually a matter of detective work. What can we find out about our loved ones? What are the evidence that is given? What are the extras that maybe a gravestone or a grave itself can show us that maybe folks like Family Past and Ancestry are unable to teach us? Okay, I want to start with a rhetorical question. Is what got you started with family research? Talking about myself personally, on my mother's side, it was chats that I had with my grandmother when I was a teenager. Now, actually, that's not me on the right-hand side. That's my baby brother, who is now 66 years of age. But every Sunday, my mum, my dad, little brother Nigel used to go 2 doors up and have lunch with my nan. And after lunch, mum, dad, and brother used to go home. And then I used to spend most of the afternoon with my nan, listening to things like Maybe Lark on the radio. And 9 times out of 10, she would end up by talking about one relative and another relative, and in the end, I couldn't work out who was who. And so I suggested that one afternoon we sat down with a piece of paper and actually plotted how all these different relatives that she was talking about fitted together. And this is actually the piece of paper that we drew up, showing all the relatives that she was aware of and the relationship between them on her side of the family, on my mother's side. I afterwards put one extra in, and that is that I married Susan Warmington. But on my father's side, it was a very different starting point. The Warmington family came from Penryn in Cornwall. And every summer, I used to spend 3 weeks holiday, actually 3 weeks holiday with my nan at the seaside, and then 3 weeks holiday with my Auntie Elsie and Uncle Alfie on the farm down in Penryn. Whether my brother and myself couldn't be trusted to go together, I don't know, but my mother used to do bed and breakfast, and so for the summer holidays we were sort of farmed out to the relatives in that particular way. And it may have been on an afternoon when I was bored, or some situation, but my aunt suggested that I walk down to the local cemetery, which wasn't all that far away from the farm, and see if I could find any Warmingtons there. And sure enough, walking around, I came across this monument, supposed to be, a grave, but it was more like a monument. And there, blazoned across the bottom, was the name Warmington. So I found one, and it absolutely intrigued me. Years later, I took this picture of it. But at the time, I just did a couple of sketches. Okay. What also fascinated me was the way in which Warmington was written across the bottom. That quite expertly done, evidently by stonemasons. Which surprised me, because when I started doing the research on the family, I found out that my great-grandparents, whose grave that was, ran a little grocery store on West Street in the town. And there's a picture of my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Warmington, previously Elizabeth King Nichols. and what looks like a passerby stopping for a chat, which turned out to be my great uncle, my grandfather's youngest brother. And there's the evidence on the left of window of the shop and a smaller window on the right-hand side. And in fact, that building is still there, and there's still the difference in terms of the window sizes. Now, the original photograph, which my cousin has got the original, was all tattooed down the right-hand side. And so I borrowed it and sent it away to be restored and have a restoration version of it made, which I was then able to distribute to different relatives. But what, as well as sort of cleaning up the picture, what happened was that over the door, it was quite evident that it was Warmington was written there, and yet on the original photograph, that wasn't all that clear. And in close-up, that is the wording, the way that Warmington is written. And of course, it is very similar to the way that the family name was written on the grave, the same sort of font. And thus, sort of a real connection between the photograph of the shop and the grave. But why? This question still bugged me. Why was a grocer and his wife, why do they have such an impressive grave? As I said, almost a monument. And there on the top of the stone is this bespeck monologue. I'm not sure what word you use, but the letters of the names. There's the W there. There's E standing for Edward, and also you might like to say Elizabeth as well. And there's at the back, you can maybe be able to see it, is a J, because my great grandfather was John Edward Warmington. And actually, that is a sketch that I took at that time to show my aunt and my other relatives. Now, on her grave, what we tend to get is just the basic information about a person, and that's our starting point. And that's what we expect to find for everyone who's got a gravestone, that information, the names of the people on it, hopefully the dates or indication of the dates of birth and death, and also to some extent relationships, as we see here with my great-grandparents. And so at the top, there's John Edward Warmington, when he was born, when he died, and underneath also Elizabeth, his wife, who died, and there's the date there, February 1910, but instead of giving a birth age 66, so you've got to do a little sum to work out roughly when she was born. But a grave, as this one does, also gives us a lot more information about the people that are buried there. The first thing, of course, is that there's mention of an extended family. You got Warmington at the top, you got Warmington in the middle, and then at the bottom, you've got a 7-year-old little girl called Elsie Burrows. So what's the connection there? Why is she buried with John Edward and Elizabeth? And of course, that takes you to other sources to look up, what is the connection between the two? And she's actually one of their grandchildren. And if you look at the dates, that they opened the grave to bury Elizabeth in February of 1910. And I suppose before they put the monument back up, little Elsie had died. And, she was put in there as well, as she only died, sort of a matter of months after her grandmother. Another family connection, which doesn't really appear there, is my auntie, Auntie Elsie. Her full name was Elizabeth Elsie, and Elizabeth presumably was named after her granny, and the name Elsie was actually named after little Elsie Burroughs, because she was born in the same year, 1910. And so we often get additional information about the family, maybe information that was unknown. Another aspect that we may find on clues about with the people that are buried in a grave are their religious affiliation. Now, often sort of the text or writing is rest in peace, may God bless you, and may God hold you in his arms, and things like that. But with John Edward and Elizabeth, the message, the religious messages that are given here show a far deeper religious interest than most other people. The fact that when John Edward died, he giveth his beloved sleep. But then especially with Elizabeth, they also that sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. And in that, there's a reference to the second coming of Christ. And so that indicates a religious interest, which is beyond I suppose, the regular sort of interest that people even in those days would have had. And in fact, John Edward and Elizabeth were members of the Bible Christian Church just down the street from them on West Street. And Bible Christians were an offshoot of Methodism, which actually became part of the United Methodist Church in 1907. And when the Methodist Church, as we know it today, came into being in 1932, they joined with the Wesleyans and the Primitive Methodists and other groups as well to form the modern Methodist Church. And John Edward was actually the senior steward within that chapel, and actually within the circuit he was very important. But also there's other things here as well. That still doesn't answer the question, is why does a grocer have such an impressive and imposing gravestone? And the answer actually lies in the fact that although he was a grocer, most of his sons, including my grandfather, were involved in the granite industry surrounding Penryn. They were stone masons and stone cutters and that. And in fact, most of my grandfather's brothers emigrated to Massachusetts when the granite industry in Cornwall started to falter in the 1880s. And so there's a connection there. And so when you add those things together, the status within the community, the fact that there was the trade connection, with through the sons and through most of the congregation in the chapel where he was senior steward, were involved in the granite industry. There's the community aspect, the fact that he was, a grocer, he was a shopkeeper in the town. The religious affiliation, there was West Street, and the family lived on the street, as was the chapel. And so together we can see why they had such an impressive grave for themselves. Now, what I've done here and over the past few months, certainly in the summer of 2020, was to look at a certain area in the cemetery, which is literally at the top of the hill where we live, just a 5-minute walk from our house up to the cemetery, Westbury Cemetery. And there was one particular area of this cemetery which I had a great interest in, and that is the unconsecrated area of the cemetery, which is on the right-hand side. If you look at it from the street, from the road, no, most of it is consecrated, and that's, I suppose, the classic picture that we often see of the cemetery, with the chapel of rest in the middle, and other buildings, and lots of lovely graves, and well-maintained graves. But on the right-hand side, the part of the cemetery that cars tend to leave the cemetery, go up on the left-hand side, around the top, and then back down the right-hand side, is the old nonconformist cemetery chapel, which is now actually a storehouse. And behind it are the graves within this unconsecrated area. So what's the difference between consecrated and unconsecrated? Well, consecrated, the area which has been consecrated and blessed by the Church of England, by the bishop. And within the unconsecrated area, I must admit, the only way I'd heard of that in the past was it's to do with suicides. And just a couple of comments here that I copied from Ruth's chat. The first one actually talks along those lines. And an 1823 statute legalized the burial of suicides in unconsecrated ground, although religious services were not permitted until 1882. So for 60 years, they were allowed to be buried in the cemetery, but no religious service whatsoever. And then it goes on quite in a very sad way. The body of a suicide can only be buried privately between the hours of 9 and 12 at night, presumably in the dark, with no religious ceremony. In 1882 was a new act which meant that the body could now be committed to the earth at any time, and with such rites or prayers as those present at the funeral thought fit or may be able to procure. And thankfully, all of that was repealed in 1961. So people who committed suicide were there, and I suppose I originally thought that it was people who had no interest in religion, that they, rather than being buried in the Church of England area, could be buried in the unconsecrated area. But the story is a bit more complicated than that. And it's this, that every parishioner had the right of burial within his parish. So anyone could actually be buried in the consecrated area, other than, of course, than suicides. Although nonconformists were usually buried in non-consecrated ground. As before 1880, no body could be buried in consecrated ground except with a service of the church. By the church, we're talking about the Church of England, which the incumbent of the parish or person authorized by him was bound to perform. So to be buried in the consecrated area, it had to be conducted, the service had to be conducted by the Church of England. And of course, if you like, both ends of the spectrum where the Christian church is concerned, Roman Catholics on one hand and the nonconformists, the Free Church on the other, would prefer to have their own priests or pastors, ministers to conduct the service. And so in unconsecrated area, we find a lot of nonconformists, especially some Roman Catholics and some who either were suicides or just didn't want any religious service taking place. Which I'm glad, because amongst those that are buried up there in the unconsecrated area of the cemetery is the first minister of the church in Westbury, which I was minister at from sort of at the end of the 20th century. The first guy was Joseph Priest, who was minister from 1839 until 75 when he died. Now, also in the grave with him, and considering the age of the stone, it's quite well preserved. Also buried with him are his wife Henrietta and his daughter, their daughter, as well. And as for Henrietta, originally she was buried actually next door to the chapel, not the chapel that there's now, but the original chapel that was built in the 1820s and replaced in the 1860s. When Joseph died, by all accounts, she must have been dug up from outside the chapel and reburied with Joseph up there. But he's not my only predecessor up there. There's Reverend George Hickman, who died in office in 1942, and also Robert Holmes Miller, who died in office in 1826. I suppose we're living in Westbury. When I die, I'll probably be buried or cremated and put in the cemetery somewhere. So with those three guys there, I'm in good company. One other minister who died living in of the church, who died when after he retired from the ministry, was Arthur Shears. Now his first wife, Amy, she is buried up there. But when Arthur and his second wife Gwen, when they both died, they were cremated and their ashes and their ashes scattered. So although they ended up in Westbury, they aren't in the cemetery. Oh yes, actually with Robert Miller's grave, unfortunately, it's now rather overgrown with its own particular jungle. But not only Baptist ministers are buried up there, there's congregationals, such as William Ball on the left-hand side, and Methodists, James Langley on the right-hand side. But other occupations other than pastors and ministers and priests are up there. And there's two examples of either an occupation or a position in society. There's Eileen Killarney, who was an SRN, state registered nurse. And therefore that is indicated on her grave. If someone is looking at the history of the Killarneys and find out that they were living in Westbury, then there's a clue as to the profession of Mrs. Killarney. And then on the right-hand side with Molly Martin, the gravestone tells us that twice she was mayor of Westbury. And again, that information may not come through from our past or ancestry or any of the regular places which we look these days for information of our ancestors. And again here with William Blewett, that the grave actually indicates that he was a member of the British Empire. And again, that piece of information regarding Mr. Blewett may not be evident in other places. And so it's important to actually look at the graves of our ancestors to see what clues that they give us about the person or persons buried within. And again, with these two, Interesting that one on the right-hand side, John Merriman, at the top of the grave has a train, and on the left with Anthony Adams, there's a ship. Now, what is the connection between John Merriman and trains? Was it that he loved trains and was fascinated by trains? He's one of those guys who when steam trains go rumbling through Westbury Station, are there with their cameras taking pictures. Or he may have been a railwayman himself working on the railways. But in some way or other, there does seem to be a connection between Mr. Merriman and trains. Or it was just the fact that the family, it may simply be a case that the family liked that design, you know, for him and his grave. And on the same on the left-hand side, was he a naval man? Well, you know, or was he just interested in ships? But there's possibly a connection here between the person and the motif on the grave that the family chose to go on his grave. And here's another grave which gives us a bit of interest. The fact that Samuel Pegg was a justice of the peace, but not of Westbury, but Hucknall in Nottinghamshire. Why is someone who is from Hucknall in Nottinghamshire buried in Westbury? Was there a family connection? You know, from my own personal family, my great-great-grandfather, his wife died in 1902 in the Forest of Dean. But when I started looking for information about great-great-grandfather himself, that couldn't be found. I searched all the graveyards around the forest and all the different contacts that I had, all came to nothing. In the end, I discovered that one of his daughters lived in the southeast of England, and later in life he developed dementia, and so they took him to the southeast to live with them. And when he died, he wasn't buried back in the forest with his wife, but was buried locally there. You know, the same thing might have happened to here. You know, the connection between Hucknall in Nottinghamshire and Westbury is something that can be explored. And then, of course, there are those that died tragically. Westbury, along with many other cemeteries, are Commonwealth graveyards. And this is one of the reasons why Westbury is, because Sergeant David Evans was killed by booby trap in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, and the date and the age that is given there, and with those dates, that information about what happened to him can be explored and looked at in the newspapers of the time, both locally and, of course, nationally as well. And here another one, John Hamilton Rodney Eden. By looks at it, to do with the RAF, that he was tragically killed in 1992. Doesn't explain why, how he was killed, whether it was a motor accident or whether he was on duty or what. And even more upsetting, I feel, is this one of Police Constable Desmond Kellam, killed on duty in October 1979, aged 31. You know, and his widow, just think of his widow, that not only did she lose her husband when he was 31, but also her son when he was just 18. And even although it is getting on for 20 years old, 30 years ago, there's still fresh flowers laid there at the cemetery, which just shows that after all these years, these two guys are very much in the hearts and minds of loved ones. And again, another one, tragically killed. And the part of the story is expressed there. A story that surely can be followed up by looking at the newspapers, the relevant newspapers at the time. This one, I suppose, is in reverse. Unfortunately, there is no indicator on the grave as to the death of David Simons. But for my research in writing the history of West End Baptist Church, David Simons was a deacon in the church in 1936, and he was tragically killed. He lived at down Coach Road, about 100 yards, 100 meters from the junction leading out onto the Trowbridge Road. And on this particular occasion, he rode his bike down to the junction and was heading towards Trowbridge. And there was a lorry coming, and unfortunately, David Simons sort of cycled out straight in front of the lorry and ended up being killed. Right, so what else can we learn from the gravestones? Not only from the writing, but from some of the symbolism that is found on graves. And we've gone back to the Killarney gravestone, where Eileen is recognised as a state registered nurse. But what about the symbolism at the top? Obviously, a religious symbol. And in fact, there are two aspects of this symbol: the X standing for Chi, the P standing for Rho, which together gives us Christos, Christ. And this is a very Roman Catholic symbol. And when you look at the surname of the family, Edward and Eileen, of Killarney, that I think we, in all probability, that they're Irish Roman Catholic people. And so, the symbolism that we see on graves actually indicates something of their background, of things that are important to them. And this is especially so with Victorian gravestones. And here's more of a monument, isn't it? There's an angel, and the angel is carrying something which, from that angle, looks very much like a sword. But actually, if you look around the back, it's not a sword, it's actually an anchor. So what is the symbolism of an angel carrying an anchor? The most obvious one, of course, is that the person buried underneath is a seafarer. But there's also another reason for it. And again, this is a very sort of high church Roman Catholic symbolism, that it stands for steadfastness in faith. And so the fact that the family were very devout in terms of their religion. There is a website which is simply entitled cemeterysymbolism.com, and there is a whole list of different symbols that were used during Victorian times, and the meaning of those symbols that were chosen by the family to represent their loved ones. An angel, as with that one just now, means guardianship of the soul. Anything broken, a broken bowl or a cup or something, means that life is being cut short. So someone who died fairly young maybe like those young men who served in the services or the police, whose lives were tragically cut short. Candle, on one hand, it might mean the spirit, the soul, or I suppose for if it's a nonconformist, a free church grave, Jesus being the light of the world. Cherub or a teddy or toy. And this is very true today, that it indicates that there's a child within that grave. A circle, meaning eternal life. The cross, I suppose one of the most obvious is the fact of Christian faith, the hope of resurrection. Dove, love, peace, freedom, lamb, Christ. And yet, I suppose on the darker side, you've got the scythe, which means the grim reaper, or a skeleton, which means death, and a skull being the reminder of mortality. And moving on, an hourglass representing the passing of time. The wording, memento mori, a reminder of death. And then with the Jewish faith, the menorah, the candlestick, or the Star of David. Flaming torch represents eternal life, light or life. Clasped hands representing parting from a loved one. An interesting stars has lots of meanings for different people. It could mean just simply divine guidance. If it's someone who's a Christian, representing Christ's wounds, or pagan background, protection. Snake, everlasting life. Sun, life. Urn, mourning. Tree, longevity. And wheat, having lived to a right age. So all these different symbolism actually indicate something about the belief system of the person or persons who have died. And actually there's a book that is available, Understanding Cemetery Symbols, which I'm sure goes into this in far greater depth than what I'm doing. Okay, going back to the area at the top of the cemetery, just before you go on to the new part, as well as the angel and the anchor, there's these two there as well. And here we see again something of, I suppose, more of the Roman Catholic symbolism. The fact that the one on the left has a cross, and inscribed across it is IHS. I've just realised that the writing on the right hand side has got it wrong. I suppose thought that meant in his service, but actually it means in hoc signo, which means by this sign, and by the sign is the cross, by this sign we conquer. And then on the right is an urn, which, as we saw just now, means mourning. But if there's a cloth, a stone cloth draped over it in the way that it is in the picture, then it means death or final petition. So, some of these symbols are quite interesting, and does raise questions as to why the family chose them. But on the other end of the religious spectrum, the Quakers, and that's the logo, or one of the logos for the Quakers, is that they will have no symbolism at all. And many free church nonconformists, rather than having symbols, would have like a scriptural text, as with the Stockwells here, of Alex and May Stockwell. Quote there from Proverbs 10 verse 17, the memory of the righteous will be a blessing. Was what the family had inscribed on their grave. A couple which maybe I think a bit really over the top. The one on the left is almost like a tract, religious tract written on the gravestone. Here lie the earthly remains of born again Christians, and at the bottom they are with their Lord. And then on the right is the Methodist minister, who has a text on his has been put on his grave, but rather than writing it in English, it's in New Testament Greek, classic Greek. John 5:24. The time is coming and is now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear it will live. You know, speaking personally, I think I'd rather have the text in English than in a language that very few people can actually read and understand. But as well as religious connections, there are other connections which can be found out by looking at the graves, such as family relationships and personal relationships. Here we have a grave in which there's Anne and John Neat, and then Elizabeth Barrett. Now, for someone who is investigating the family of Anne and John Neat, may or may not be aware of that relationship. You know, presumably, well, it looks as though it's a family member. But as with the Warmington Burroughs grave of my great-grandparents, you know, often we find connections on a grave that may or may not have been previously known. This one is a non-family relationship, but actually is a relationship which is explained beautifully on this very simple memorial inscription for the Cockles from their grateful evacuee, John Nicholson. And so presumably this was a couple who had taken Jack in during the Second World War, and he was so grateful that he actually paid for the you know, for the grave, and not to brag, but to just to show his relationship, his connection with this couple who had this family who had taken him in. Another thing which graves sometimes can give us, which may not be obvious unless it was known, and certainly it wouldn't be shown in things like Find My Past and Ancestry and their records, and that is the way in which people were known as in the family, amongst their friends. You know, Dorothy, and okay, it's quite a common one, but Dot, Warburton, and John, known as Jack. If someone is writing the story of that couple, obviously they put their name in full, but then as they tell their story, that they would be able to use the name by which they were known as, you know, Dot and Jack. In many ways, those are quite common, but I cannot work out the connection why Philip John Pynchon was known as Dick. Now, if the surname was Turpin, I could understand, but not Pynchon. But that's what he was known as. That was, you know, that name was must have been associated with him either from teenage or from working situation or from the services, and that stuck. And from there on, he was known as Dick. Also, what we see on that grave is again family connections, that Betty, his wife, was wife, mother, and grandmother. And that, again, if we weren't aware of family connections, really opens up things and causes us to possibly to search elsewhere. And this one, I'm fascinated by the the beautiful names. Clementina, Cecilia Rope, known as Nina, Daisy Emily Every, which is quite a bit of a tongue twister in that. What's the relationship between these elderly ladies? Maybe they've been the best of friends. I did look, and I don't think either of them married. So there was a deep friendship over the years, which meant that at the end of their lives, they ended up being buried together. And going back, thinking about family, on the left-hand side, I knew Marg Wielden. She was a lady that I used to visit until her death in 2006. And here you've got a family who really looked after and cared for their maiden aunts. If you look at the date of Marg's death, in 2006, well, that is now 14 years ago, and there's still flowers, fresh flowers, put on the grave by nieces and others. And really had to think about with Edna, because it refers to her as sister, auntie, and grandma. Now, I can't find any evidence that she had any illegitimate children or anything like that. I think it's just the case that she was so affectionately known within the family that she was referred to as grandma rather than great aunt or auntie. Such was the affection that the family held for these two lovely ladies. And on the other hand, on the right-hand side, is the grave of Alfred Hall, and the state that his grave has ended up in, and partly is because he didn't have any family to look after the grave afterwards. His wife died young, and his two daughters again died very young as well. The other aspect, another aspect that is important here, is to look at the wealth of different people. Being naughty, I saw a picture there of the consecrated area, and all the graves look really neat and tidy and well looked after, and that. And then you turn the corner and you look at the unconsecrated area, and there's a whole area which looks as though there's no graves there at all, but actually they are. All of that area is covered with graves. The one right at the front there, on the left-hand side off the picture on the left, there is a couple of more graves, but the one right in the very middle was the only grave in that whole row of gravestone and the whole of the row of graves. And you've got to think that why are there, especially at that time, why were there so few graves? And the answer, of course, is that there was no cremation, so anyone who died had to be buried, and by the time the family had paid for the burial, there was just no spare cash in which to have a gravestone built. There might have been a pot there at one time. There might have been a pot, but that got lost. In fact, I was talking to someone on one of my visits up to the cemetery, And they were saying that the undertaker had said to them, well, there's no need to put anything there, no need to have a gravestone, because you know where they're buried, which may be true, but of course in later years no one is going to know who is buried where up there, other than if they look at the official records. Talking about pots, here's 3 examples of of different pots. The one on the left-hand side is a relative of Mike Doughty. The one on the right is a lady called Molly Norris, as you can see. Unfortunately, I cannot find any record of Molly Norris living in Westbury, so that is very much an unknown. And then the one in the middle is of Bob Savory. Many people who have lived in Westbury a long time be very aware of Bob Savory. In fact, he wrote, he had a column in the Wiltshire, regular column in the Wiltshire Times, and also put many of the anecdotes and those articles, column articles, into this little book, Little Lane and Beyond. Of course, there are these grander ones, and the 3 of these we've already looked at. The 2 on the left, then the one up in amongst the trees with the angel and the anchor, because that grave actually covers 4 plots, because there are so many of the family buried there. And in fact, the one in the foreground actually covers 2 plots because of the size of the family. And on all 4 of those, they're far grander monuments than many of the other gravestones, and certainly grander than the pots that are there. Now, plain graves does not necessarily mean lack of wealth. A shop that remained open until 2020 up opposite Morrison's is F.G. Collier, which started off as a coal depot, originally owned by Frederick George Collier, and his grave is on the left. And then his son Percy and daughter-in-law Mabel, they took over the business later and built it up so that it became the largest coal depot believed by the family to be in the southwest of England, until Donovan was, I suppose because of age, forced to close it during the epidemic of last year. I'm not really sure what the majority of the traditional graves are made of, whether it's limestone or other soft sedimentary rock, but many of them, of course, are losing their definition. At the end of this talk, there's reference to Find a Grave, and the photos of Westbury Cemetery that are on that website were taken a few years ago now, and actually many of them show a better definition than what they are now. Certainly today, if someone has a loved one buried, then the gravestone tends to be of granite or marble, and that's true in both the consecrated and unconsecrated areas of the cemetery. And of course, a more modern trend is to be a celebration of the person concerned, and more and more graves these days are actually have a photograph of the loved one on the gravestone. I just hope that the definition of the writing and the picture does stay for a long time and doesn't sort of fade after a couple of decades or so. This one actually caused me a bit of amusement, because there is memory of Leonard Smith, dearest husband, father, and grandfather, and his dates. But the picture of it on it is that of Amber, the dog. Now, whether Amber is buried with his master, I don't know. But rather than the picture of the person concerned, the picture of the dog has been chosen instead. Okay, so in conclusion, being a detective with graves, we get a lot of the basic information from the MI, from the memorial inscription. Is also likely to see relationships, family, alternative names, names that people are called. Any additional information, hopefully, you've seen from the graves that we've looked at, that we learn far more than that from the MI and also the grave itself. We see something of the interests and personal values, such as religion. It's always good to have a good understanding of the local locality, because that can show different lights on the person concerned. To look at the environment that grave is in, that grave has, compared to other graves surrounding it. Or obviously, there's other graves of the same family names, that repeatedly, there's certain names, even in the area that I looked at, the same surnames are repeated, and some of those names aren't common ones, and so there would tend to be a family connection there. It's good to look at the material used for the grave and the gravestone, and how it's cared for. That when I showed you the picture of the Alfred Hall's grave, which had fallen into disrepair because there was no one in the family to look after it over the decades, and yet others, especially of a young person who had died, those graves tend to be really well cared for, and flowers are put there fresh, throughout the year. Just to say that the research that I did within the unconsecrated area of the cemetery at Westbury has been turned into a book, which hopefully will be available for sale as a printed copy when the pandemic is over. But with Westbury, we're very fortunate in the fact that someone who's given themselves the name Moonraker, good Wiltshire name, has entered onto the Find a Grave website over 4,000 of the graves within Westbury Cemetery, and with a claim that 99% are photographed. Okay, so just in conclusion, picking up an odd grave that I knew nothing about, I've tried to sort of follow this example and what I've been talking about, and from the grave to see what I can discover about the people. And first of all, from the inscription on the grave itself, that it was a red granite gravestone, which is good preservation after all of these years. The family name is a double-barreled name, and in fact there are 5 graves within the unconsecrated area of the cemetery that have Hooper Greenhills buried there, with connection with Francis Henry. It talks about the word Mizpah, meaning watchtower, is mentioned. So there's certainly some religious connection there. And Mizpah basically means, may God watch over you. Obviously, there's the death of Francis there as the result of wounds which he sustained during the First World War in France. Frank died in 1937, but then Ada actually outlived both of their children, both Francis Henry and also Elsie. So, of course, that led me on to other investigations through the Commonwealth War Graves website. Found out that that Francis belonged to the 6th Battalion of the Dorsetshire Regiment, and that's where he was buried. And again, it's got the reference that he was the son of Frank and Ada, and they lived on the road in Westbury. So from that, we know whereabouts they lived. But other carrying on other research, although the name isn't actually on the tomb there, in terms of the cemetery records, that there's also an unnamed Brady connected with the with the grave, and actually on the 1939 register, there's Ada and Elsie there. And Elsie is put down as a cheese factory machinist, but there's a Thomas Brady and an evacuated mother and son. So not just the son, but the mother as well. And their names, of course, are written. And looking elsewhere, that in the last quarter of 1939, Elsie actually married this Thomas Brady. And sort of further research found that there's a family connection with Savorys. Bob Savorys' sister Olive married a Gilbert Hooper Greenhill in 1937. And then going back further, I found the marriage of Frank Hooper Greenhill and Ada, her surname before marriage was Batt. And then again on the 1911 census, the family home was Lower Road, that Frank was a leather dyer, and in the house, as well as Frank, was Ada, Henry, Hilda, another daughter, and then Elsie. And I'm sure if I spent more time, I'd probably find out more about that family, but starting, as I did so, from the grave itself.